talk about is really the negative philosophy in today's debate round. And when I say philosophy, I mean our foundational argument that we're operating from when we look at all these other points in today's debate round. Now our argument is really twofold. What we're saying is that right now this issue of cluster munitions is being addressed in the status quo. And that second of all, the affirmative team's plan has no hope for benefit. Really the only possibility is a possibility for disaster. Now what I'm going to be doing in today's speech is I'm going to be looking at two issues. First of all, is there any potential for gain with an affirmative ballot? Is Russia actually going to accept this treaty? And then second of all, look at the ramifications if Russia accepted the treaty. Would they be good or would they be bad? Now first I'd like to start with this issue of Russia's desire to accept the treaty. And I'd like to begin by addressing Lydia's responses in her last speech. Now the first response that she gave is she said that our evidence talking about this similar treaty was not the same treaty as the treaty that they're presenting. And my response is yes, it's not the same treaty, but the principle still applies. What principle were we trying to develop? What we were saying is in the past, when we presented a treaty to Russia that did not include their input on the treaty, where we were not actively dialoguing with them on the treaty, they rejected the treaty. They only want to accept treaties where they're included in the negotiation process and there is dialogue beforehand. The affirmative team's case does no such thing. What it does is it outlines the standard that says, look, will you sign this? That's not how Russia wants to sign treaties. It's not how they've done so in the past. The principle still applies even if the treaty is different. And the next argument that the affirmative team gave is they stated, well, we really need to be quoting Russian officials on this issue. And I have two responses to this. She then quoted a Russian official. First of all, looking at the idea of, well, do we need to quote Russian officials? Well, that seems like a good idea. We believe as a negative team that it's more important to look at Russian action in the past than look at individual Russian officials. Why? Because individual Russian officials do not make Russian policy. It's more accurate to track Russia's actions in the past and look at how they behave as a nation than to simply look at one official's position. Let's look at what that official actually said. If you look at the card that the affirmative team read, they stated that, quote, if the Geneva negotiation process results in agreements on cluster munitions, then we'll sign the treaty. Now there's a few reasons why this is inapplicable to the situation at hand. First of all, this is talking about a work in progress. It's saying, look, if this work in progress is successful, then we'll sign the success. It's not saying that we'll sign the rough draft that never was really perfected. But second of all, this is assuming that Russia was included in the negotiation process. Judge, what I would like you to remember about the affirmative team's plan is that they do not dialogue with Russia over the standards that they're presenting. They're simply presenting the standards saying, take it or leave it. There is no room for compromise, no room for basically bargaining on those standards. That makes this situation completely inapplicable. And the third argument that she gave, she said, well, if the United States bans these munitions, then Russia's going to follow suit. And I have two responses to this. My first response is we need to realize that Russia right now has actually been moving away from cluster munitions. And this is from Dr. Stuart Casey Moslin, who said in October of 2010 that, quote, Russia is party to the Convention on Conventional Weapons and ratified Protocol 5 on Explosive Remnants of War on July 21st, 2008. This convention was basically a convention to address the humanitarian impacts of cluster munitions. So basically, Russia's already taking actions now to move away from cluster munitions. The difference, though, is that the affirmative team's case is basically saying, well, we want you to basically respond to United States dictates. We want you to listen to what the United States has to say, and Russia is not going to do that. They're not going to simply follow what the United States is saying. And I'd like to read a quick card from Ariel Cohen in 2006, excuse me, that says that, quote, the goal of United Russia and its president is to make Russia once again an autonomous international player by returning to the values that made it strong in the past. The word I'd like to focus on here is autonomous international player. That's actually a few words. But what this evidence is saying is it's saying that Russia wants to act in its own sovereignty, basically. It wants to act according to its own desires. It will sign treaties when it's included in the negotiation process, but it's not simply going to respond to U.S. dictates. Russia can phase out their cluster munitions, but they're not going to do so as a result of the affirmative team's case. So now that we've looked at all of those arguments, I'd like to bring up three additional reasons why Russia is not going to sign this treaty. And the first is that the United States is singling Russia out. We're singling Russia out with an affirmative ballot. Now I already talked about how Russia has ratified the Convention on Conventional Weapons, and actually this convention was international in its scope. As Ambassador Stephen Mull pointed out in 2008, quote, we have been pursuing addressing the problem of cluster munitions through the Convention on, I'm just going to abbreviate this as the CCW. He says that, quote, that venue is the right place to solve this because it is the place where all of the principal producers and users of these munitions vote and participate and work together. Last year we succeeded in getting agreement from everybody to negotiate a new protocol to regulate the use of cluster munitions in order to address the humanitarian issues that are involved with them, end quote. The basic idea that I'd like to draw from this piece of evidence is that this agreement that Russia just signed is international. Now what we as the United States will be doing, though, under the Affirmative Team's plan, is rather than presenting another international treaty, we're singling out Russia specifically, saying, look, you are the only nation that we want to hold to this new standard. How is Russia going to view that? Well, Russia in the past has viewed these types of actions as basically the United States setting double standards for Russia. They do not respond favorably, as the Washington Quarterly noted in the fall of 2008. They stated that, quote, having rejected any kind of ideology as an impediment and having embraced pragmatism themselves, Moscow sees Washington's talk of values as essentially disingenuous, thoroughly compromised by double standards and serving the purpose of global expansionism, end quote. The way that Moscow views our talk of values right now is that it's compromised by double standards. Basically, we single out Russia, we act in an unfair manner towards Russia. That's exactly what the Affirmative Team does. They single out Russia. Russia's not going to sign the treaty. Second reason I'd like to bring up is that Russia would rather keep their cluster munitions information confidential. They don't want to be revealing this to the world. As Dr. Stuart Casey, who has a PhD, noted in October of 2010, quote, according to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, quote, the quantity and types of cluster munitions stockpiled in the Russian Ministry of Defense are confidential and will not be publicized, end quote. Russia does not want to be revealing this information to the world. They do not want to sign a treaty where they're going to have to specify exactly what type of munitions they have. And the third and final reason is that Russia has no real consideration. They do not value human rights in the same manner that the United States does, so there's no real incentive for them to ratify the treaty. Dr. Roy Allison noted in 2009 that, quote, there's been little to show that Russia has actually held serious humanitarian concerns in South Ossetia at any time in the post-Soviet period. Nor does humanitarianism seem to have motivated Russian policy in the wider region. And it goes on to give other examples. Russia is not going to sign this unilateral treaty that the United States is just presenting to them and saying, we want to hold you to this standard. It's not going to happen. Now the second issue I'd like to talk about is the ramifications if it did happen. Basically what we see is we see that we're masking the larger issue. We view it as solved when really it isn't. There are two other major problems that we would need to be addressing. First of all, the problem of other weapons. As Richard Kidd noted in 2008, quote, the real looming global crisis resides in the threat from surplus, abandoned, and improperly stored conventional munitions, not cluster munitions. He's talking about how there are other types of weapons that cause more civilian casualties and are just as big of a problem as cluster munitions. The final issue is how we use our weapons today. Many times when we've seen cluster munitions lead to civilian deaths, it's because we've been targeting areas that have a vast amount of civilians in them. That is also an issue, and this will all be ignored if you vote for the Affirmative Team. Please stick with the status quo and take the slow international response that we're working with right now. Thank you very much. I now stand ready for cross-examination.
Our team provided in order for you to change from our current policy of having 99% reliable cluster munitions to their 99% reliable sensor-fused cluster munitions. And really what I'm going to be showing you is that there's really no reason to change this policy. They had two justifications. I'd like to look at the first one first. It's the human life justification. And they had essentially two different subpoints under this argument. The first of these was that the new policy of having 99% successful cluster munitions is not legally mandated. Essentially, it's not legally binding. I guess we could eventually at some point change back to our old policy of, I guess, 35% effective cluster munitions. We have two responses. So what? Even if it's not legally mandated, it is our policy stance, and we are moving towards actually initiating that actual policy. We're going to have 99% successful cluster munitions, and there's no reason to believe that we're going to go back to our old policy. The second response, though, is that we have been destroying these stockpiles of other options. Essentially, the 99% reliable ones are the only ones that we're going to be able to use. As the Joint Force Quarterly said in 2009, quote, a DoD policy on cluster munitions was signed by Secretary of Defense Robert Gates. This is a clear indication that the Department of Defense understands the concern over these weapons. This policy means that almost none of our existing stockpile can be retained. Unquote. We had to destroy about 90% to 95% of our stockpile in order to keep with this policy. It is a policy, and that's good enough. We're actually we're enacting this policy in order to go to the 99% standard. The second subpoint was that this isn't as good as the sensor-fused weapons, and we have 3 responses under this subpoint. The first of these is that we've seen no casualty difference between the reliable cluster munitions and these new sensor-fused weapons. We simply have not seen it. No reason to prefer the sensor-fused weapons over the 99% reliable ones. Second response is that reliable weapons, the 99% success rate ones, are actually improving accuracy, which is essentially the only thing that the affirmative team has said would be the good part about the sensor-fused weapons. Again, as the Joint Force Quarterly said in 2009, quote, newer generations of sensor-fused submunitions are being introduced, and they have been shown to improve munition and submunition accuracy, and produce a large number of residual unexploded submunitions. Actually, that's the wrong quote. I wasn't supposed to read that one. So I'm going to move on to our third response, which is that if these sensor-fused munitions are more reliable, the United States military will adopt them. If they're a better weapon, the United States military is going to use the best weapon. The only reason that the affirmative team gave us for not using these new weapons is because of cost. This is simply ridiculous. The United States military doesn't really care about cost. The United States federal government doesn't care about cost. They've spent trillions of dollars on things that they can't even account for, and yet we're going to say that they're not going to spend a little bit more money on a much more effective weapon? That makes no sense whatsoever. If this is a better weapon, the United States military will start using it, and essentially the affirmative team's plan will be enacted by basically the status quo. Therefore, there's no reason for you to vote for the affirmative team's plan. The second justification was that of military supremacy, and there's 3 subpoints under this argument. The first of these was that our argument was that the newer cluster munitions were decreasing casualties, and after 2003, that casualties have been declining. They responded with, there's still lots of casualties, and they used the example of Laos, and basically our response here is this example does not apply because, as I pointed out in cross-examination, these were using old munitions during the Vietnam War, which were probably those of 35% success rate. That's a much lower percentage than what we use right now. Those casualty numbers do not apply. We need to see casualty numbers at the 99% success rate, and really whether or not there's a significant reason to change there. The second subpoint on the second justification is that of cluster munitions being used as a terror recruitment tool. Now, our argument was that it doesn't matter what weapon we use to strike, terrorists are going to use American strikes as a recruitment tool anyway. They said it's specifically unexploded bomblets that are the problem. Our response is that their evidence did not say anything about that. Their specific quote that said that it was being used as a recruitment tool said this: it is incredibly dangerous that what the United States is trying to do in Yemen at the moment because it really fits into Al-Qaeda and the Arabian Peninsula's broader strategy. They are able to make the argument that Yemen is a legitimate front for jihad. They've been making that argument since 2007, but incidents like this are all sort of fodder for their argument. Unquote, it's attacks in and of themselves which serve as fodder. Even if we use non-cluster munitions, they're still going to claim that as a recruitment tool. And finally, they said that sensor-fused weapons are better. If so, the United States military will adopt them, and there's no need for the affirmative team's plan. Thank you very much.
And the negative. Excellent. I admire Cameron's faith in the U.S. military, and obviously comes from living in the South, but as a Northerner, I'm not quite as confident. Basically what we look at is the U.S. military is actually quite dumb when it comes to upgrading their weaponry because they don't like change. They like to use, when they have 728 million of a weapon, they're not going to throw that out just because something's better and costs $100,000 more. That doesn't work despite Republican tendencies from the negative team. What we're going to be looking at in the 1AR is the fundamental premise that Russia actually will agree to this treaty, and conceded by the negative team for the entire round, the fact that sensor-fused weapons are better. Because ultimately what it comes down to is not whether or not cluster munitions are the worst weapon in existence as much as whether cluster munitions are worse than sensor-fused weapons. And if we prove that to you at the end of the round, that warrants an affirmative ballot. So let's move first into solvency. They had a lot of specific solvency arguments, but basically I have 3 overarching responses, and I'll tie them in as I go along. First deals with the fact that Russia was involved and that Russia actually was in the negotiations process itself. Let's look at what Steve Goose testified in a statement to the Plenary Convention on Conventional Weapons, the group of governmental experts, November 2008. Quote, 26 nations issued a joint statement that they could not accept the draft CCW protocol text, followed by a defense of the text by the US, Russia, and it proceeds to list several other countries. The United States and Russia were in the negotiations process. Both countries were involved in this draft text, and both of them are defending it. Russia likes it. Now let's go to the second overall response, because they talk about how Russia doesn't like human rights. Actually, the fact of the matter is they do. The piece of evidence from the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, this is essentially their Department of State, said, quote, Russia admits the use of cluster munitions in the course of armed conflict in recent years has had serious negative consequences. Seeking to make our contribution to their solution, if the Geneva negotiations process results in agreements on cluster munitions, we will be prepared to undertake commitments they would involve. Now they talked about how that was the draft, not the final issue. It's called a draft because the convention wasn't signed then and proceeded to be edited in future years. But the 2007 text is what Russia said they would agree to. Here's my third overarching response. Unresponded to by the negative team is the fact that U.S. action solves. That if the U.S. removes its cluster munitions, Russia will follow along because it has no reason not to. Never refuted by the negative team. That piece of evidence specifically said if the U.S. signed on, other nations would have no reason not to. Now let's look at the specifics though. He talks about how the principle still applies that Russia doesn't like being singled out and not being included. That's responded to by my first response. We are not singling them out per se in the sense that their autonomy is violated as much as because 1, they're the second largest user, 2, because they share our view on the protocol, and 3, because they've expressed a desire to solve the issue. That's why we directly address them. I'd also point out none of their evidence talking about how Russia likes to be autonomous was specific to our plan. Now they talk about though how Russia likes to keep their cluster munition data confidential, and so does the United States. We don't go around publishing lists of our military arsenals, where they're stocked and what they include. Fundamentally though, their evidence never said that was a barrier to cooperation. New START doesn't publish the list of every single nuclear weapon for all to see or even share all the data with the countries, but it has verification procedures in place to make sure the weapons are still destroyed. Overall, the response under solvency is the negative has not read one single piece of evidence. They haven't given you one single warrant why Russia rejects the 2007 text or why they would reject it in bilateral form. We see empirically and theoretically that they would accept. Let's move to the justifications. Basically, he talked under the first justification about how we're going to 99% and that's successful. Unfortunately, what he conceded in the first cross-examination was that 99% munitions are reliable, thus legacy, thus indiscriminate. That's what all of our 1AC was talking about, why they were unacceptable. And my second overall response to his significance argument about 99%, nowhere do they talk about Russia. All they're talking about is the United States, but there's two parties at issue in our convention. Russia's cluster munitions have a 35% dud rate, and if you vote for the negative, you leave those duds in place because Russia's not removing them. Now let's move to the disadvantage. They basically said, well, a lot of other weapons are more dangerous. Yeah, if you lump all other conventional weapons in a stack and compare them to cluster munitions, they're going to be more dangerous. But what the negative never responded to was our card in the first justification that said basically except for nuclear weapons and smallpox, chemical or cluster munitions are more dangerous to civilians than any other weapon. What you're left with at the end of the round is conceded by the negative team the fact 1, Russia's cluster munitions are indiscriminate killers, 2, sensor-fused weapons are better, and 3, US initiating this treaty results in Russian ratification. I'd ask for an affirmative ballot.
First voting issue is that there will be no difference made by an affirmative ballot because quite simply Russia's not going to accept this piece of legislation. Now, the affirmative speaker said that we did not give you any warrants for why this is the case. Well, actually, in my speech, that is all I was trying to do, is give you reasons why Russia's not going to accept. In this speech, what I'd like to do is I'd like to narrow it down to 3 significant reasons. The first reason is because the affirmative team's case uses unrealistic implementation. It does not include Russia in the actual dialogue and ratification of this treaty. Now, what the affirmative speaker talked about in his last speech, he said, well, there are these negotiations in the past, we came up with this draft, Russia liked it, etc., 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 that's what we're presenting them to them. Judge, the fact of the matter is, when we as the United States present treaties to other nations, we talk to them about the treaties. For instance, in the past when we were coming up with this draft, we included Russia in the process. The affirmative team's plan bypasses that process. What they do is, even if they present an old draft, they're simply saying, look, here's what we want, and we're simply going to offer it to you, and you need to accept it. They do not have any type of negotiation or dialogue process within their case, which basically shows a disregard for Russia's, whatever issues Russia might would have with the specific draft. So that's the first reason why Russia's not going to accept, because we have unrealistic implementation. Second reason they're not going to accept it is because they're being singled out in the world today. Now the affirmative team gave multiple reasons why they're singling Russia out, but I'd just like to give you a few responses. Well, first of all, I'd like to give you the fact that some of those reasons also apply to other nations. They said, well, Russia supported this draft. Other nations supported this draft as well. Why are we just presenting this treaty to Russia? Sure, Russia might be one of the largest hosts of these cluster munitions, but other nations host them as well. And finally, what I'd like to talk about is the fact that this is not the typical way that the United States works on this issue. When we try to effect change on issues such as cluster munitions, we use international frameworks. That's what we've done in the past. All of a sudden, we're singling Russia out, which creates the perception that, look, you guys are the problem, not the rest of the world. The final reason why Russia's not going to accept this plan is because they do not want to have to verify their cluster munitions. They want to keep their stockpiles secret. And what the affirmative team said is they said, well, we're not publishing the numbers, we're just going to verify them later on. Judge, that's what Russia doesn't want. I'm not saying that, well, Russia's just concerned about having their stuff on the, their numbers and their munitions published on the internet. I'm saying that this is a problem because they don't want anyone to know the specifics of their stockpiles. Because of that, they're not going to pass this treaty. What I would contend is that if as the United States continues to make changes on this issue of cluster munitions, Russia will follow suit, but they will do so in an autonomous manner as they feel it is necessary. The affirmative team's argument that Russia follows the United States' lead is true for the most part. As far as when the United States takes actions, Russia will follow. That's what's going to happen in the status quo. Russia will pursue the elimination of these munitions, but they will do so by themselves, not at the dictate of the United States. Now, the second voting issue in today's debate round is that the affirmative team's plan is unnecessary because the United States is already addressing this issue. Now, they stated that, well, basically, these munitions that we're incorporating are just as bad. As my partner talked about, he was saying that, look, we have a 99%, we're getting that same accuracy rating with these munitions that we're incorporating that the affirmative team is talking about. We will have that accuracy. As we discover new technologies that work, our military incorporates them. As my partner, he not only just using his Southern background, but also using actual evidence, in the past, when we've had new types of technology discovered, the United States military has incorporated them. We're moving away from cluster munitions towards safer munitions in the status quo. The impact of this is, first of all, the United States problem is being solved right now, and that second of all, Russia's problem is being solved. We've already seen that they've ratified an international treaty, and in addition to that, they follow the United States leading. We see that this issue is being addressed. The final reason that we need to vote against the affirmative team, though, is because they mask the broader issue. They're passing a piece of legislation that will basically create the perception that, look, the problem of civilian deaths is addressed. The issue is cluster munitions, and that's been solved. But Judge, unfortunately, the issue is broader than just cluster munitions. Even though cluster munitions do cause problems, there are other problems in the status quo. In fact, it's debatable whether or not the cluster munitions are the biggest problem as far as civilian casualties are concerned. I specifically read a card that said that conventional munitions are the issue, and then another card talking about how one of the reasons why we've seen so many civilian casualties is because the way our military strategy works, we end up targeting areas that will necessarily lead to civilian casualties. These are major issues. We must not pass legislation that's going to cause our government to create the perception that the problem is fixed when we know that the problem isn't fixed. Please stick with the status quo with an implementation that works, an implementation that addresses the entire problem, and an implementation that will not offend Russia. Thank you very much.
Right now, the United States and Russia are both using a weapon that is not at the best weapon that we could be using. We have a better alternative that we could be using, and both of us, as the two largest users of cluster munitions, have the responsibility to be using the best weapon available. We are not doing that. That is a simple fact of the current system, and that's why our plan is needed. That's really what I'm going to be going back to as the theme in the speech, in this last speech for today's debate round. We're going to be looking at all the issues through three main voting issues. First, I'm going to be looking at the current system, really addressing the negative team's point, saying what we're doing right now really isn't that bad. Secondly, I'm going to be looking at the voting issue of Russia, whether or not they're going to comply with this plan. And lastly, we're going to look at the voting issue of how we have a superior alternative available and why sensor-fused weapons are the choice that we should be taking. Let's start off, though, with the first voting issue, that of the current system. Now, here we're going to just lay out a couple of facts that really both teams have agreed to in today's debate round. The first is that weapons, cluster munitions the United States has used before are still killing people decades after the bombs were dropped. That is a fact that both teams have agreed to past use of cluster munitions when we use these older weapons, they are still killing people today because they left behind remnants that essentially turned into landmines and are still killing civilians, never refuted by the negative team. Second fact there is that weapons we are using now, we've upgraded, sure, they now have a 99% reliability rate, but they still cannot be aimed. Reliable munitions, which is the category we're primarily using right now, have a 99% explosion rate, but do not have targeting or self-destruct mechanisms. That's what the sensor fused weapon has, both of those features, and that's what makes it much better than what we're using right now. The third point that has really not been strongly contested is that what we're doing right now is inciting jihadist hatred against any country that uses the weapon, be it the United States or Russia. When we have a country that goes in to use a weapon, and decades after the conflict, civilians are still dying because we essentially planted landmines in their country, that is going to incite, justly so, hatred for the country that came in, because we are essentially preventing that country from ever getting back on its feet if we planted landmines all over their country. That's a problem in the current system, and we need to fix it. Lastly, let's look at his point saying that the current system is improving. There is no mandate right now requiring the United States to upgrade to sensor-fused weapons. Negative team has admitted this. They have never read evidence saying the military is planning on using sensor-fused weapons. It's the fact we're not planning on upgrading anytime soon. Fifth and final response underneath this point, Russia is doing nothing. The negative team read evidence saying, well, they're party to various treaties, but they couldn't provide a single example of Russia doing anything on cluster munitions. The weapons they're using now fail 35% of the time. That is not acceptable for the United States or Russia. Let's move on to voting issue 2, that of Russian compliance. I have a couple of points underneath this. My primary point here, though, is if we look at the evidence issue here, which team has read more evidence on this point? I read 2 pieces of evidence in my 2AC saying specifically, our plan, the 2007 protocol that we are using, Russia has come out and stated as an official press release of their government that they support it. In the 1AR, my partner read a piece of evidence saying Russia protested when those negotiations fell through. Russia came out in defense of them. Russia has publicly supported our plan. Their government is officially in favor of this plan. The negative team has never contested that fact. Second of all, the whole issue of the dialogue and whether or not they were going to be included in the negotiations. This is really the main reason that the negative team has had, saying Russia won't like your plan because they're not included in negotiations. They never really addressed the fact, though, that my partner said in his speech, he very clearly outlined how when we had these negotiations in 2007, Russia was included. What you are passing, if you pass our plan, is what Russia has already negotiated to. They have already sat down and said, we agree to these stipulations. That's what we're passing. Russia is entirely included in this plan text. Let's move on to the last issue here, talking about the confidentiality. This really isn't an issue. Russia has already come out and said they're willing to do this. They can keep some confidentiality for sure and still upgrade to a better weapon. Let's move on to the last voting issue, the whole issue of sensor-fused weapons. My first point here is that never throughout today's entire debate round have we heard a single piece of evidence saying anything bad about sensor-fused weapons. So Judge, essentially, you have no reason to not upgrade to a better weapon. It costs a little bit of money, but we've shown you from a national security perspective and a humanitarian perspective why we need to upgrade. So there's no disadvantages to this. Secondly, we look at the masking disadvantage briefly. The fact remains that the negative team never refuted the fact that of all conventional weapons that we're using, this is one of the very worst that there are. And the United States is the main user of one of the worst conventional weapons that there are. This is really unacceptable. We have a better alternative. The United States and Russia can easily upgrade. There's no real disadvantage to doing so, and Russia has said they would come out and do this. So for these reasons, we strongly believe that an upgrade is warranted in today's debate round. Thank you.